The call should have come at 6:15 p.m. A short message to puncture the heat haze between the living room and the desert, one line confirming arrival at the road, and a cheap diner where dust settles into sugar dispensers and the ice machine rattles like bones. Instead, there was silence, the kind that expands until it feels architectural, load-bearing, casting its own shadow across the evening. 19-year-old Claire Donnelly and her best friend, 18-year-old Jacob Rios, had walked into one of the hottest, driest places on the continent, with a plan printed in small, disciplined boxes. They carried more water than anyone told them they'd need, trail maps laminated against sweat and time, and a bright orange satchel with a satellite emergency beacon float-tested in a bathtub the night before. Strip out the illusions, and what remained was this: a numbered day, a promised phone call, and then nothing. The first hours were disbelief, masquerading as patience. That patience died when Claire's older sister drove a borrowed pickup to the trailhead and found the car they had left behind hadn't moved, its interior hotter than memory. The ticket stub from a roadside market curled like a leaf. Rangers found footprints on the first 100 yards of gravel, the kind that exist only until wind or chance decides they never did. After that, the desert swallowed the narrative and offered no exchange. By dawn the next morning, the search began. And it began with heat. Heat that lifted off salt flats and distorted the line where rock meets sky. Heat that makes distance a liar. Heat that reduces even the loudest engines to a low animal groan. Helicopters swept canyons, cut by water that rarely shows itself. Volunteers fanned out with radios pinned to their collars that hissed with static and the occasional brittle report. Every hour a new grid went up on a whiteboard, lines overlaid on older lines until the landscape looked like something stitched and not healed. Claire and Jacob were not reckless. They were meticulous in the way anxious people are, and anxious people survive. They chose a route that flirted with danger, while remaining wedded to established paths, a loop promising arches like fossilized waves, and a shallow pass to a backcountry road where Jacob's brother had arranged to pick them up. He waited. They did not come. By the second day, the small items that serve as faith began to appear and disappear. A piece of pink nylon that caught a ranger's eye, then proved to be nothing more than a weathered ribbon, a stainless bottle that belonged to no one, and a tire track where no truck should have been that turned into a snake of shade and wind. Search dogs walked nose down along fans of rock and fine powder, where scent adheres only if the air allows it. The air did not. What replaced evidence was pattern, the way heat kills options, the way the land directs and deceives, and the arithmetic of distance and water. The families arrived and remained at the rim of maps, while the professionals did what professionals do, borrowed time from a place that had none to lend. When the first theory collapsed, another took its place. Maybe a wrong turn in a canyon that looks different every hour. Maybe heat illness with its soft-handed theft of judgment. Maybe a fall beyond the sight line, where sound is a rumor and light cannot bend. Each scenario carried its own prayer. Days achieved a rhythm that felt like ritual. Pre-dawn briefings with coffee gone bitter and necessary. Wheels rolling before the first birds had the courage to complain. The landscape taking the people into itself and then letting them back out with sunburn and smaller hopes. At the end of day 5, a drone operator found a heat signature that quickened hearts and knees. The image was bright within the frame, and then it wasn't. A miner's ghost turned to glare from a slab. At the end of day 7, someone reached a dry fall littered with small stones, arranged in a way that might be random, and because they might not be, the fall was photographed and flagged and revisited. Nothing. By day 10, the edges of the search had frayed. Resources do not bend to grief and hold the shape. This is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. The official operation scaled back. The desert returned to its previous project, enduring. Yet the families do not scale back. They shift into a different velocity. They became archivists of the last known, the last receipt, the last message. The last joke told across a kitchen table. A promise of a ridiculous souvenir rock, the kind sold by weight and by the pound of parent pride. They became students of the place, memorizing the names of features that are themselves the language of loss. Furnace, devil, Badwater, Black Mountains, and Funeral Range. They believed that somewhere there was a single hinge. Find it, and the door opens. The hinge, when it finally revealed itself, was not discovered by rangers or volunteers or drones, but by a graduate researcher walking a transect with a handheld sensor that listens to the ground the way a doctor listens to a chest. The researcher was not seeking people. They were mapping small tremors that never reach newspapers, motions of rock and brine that write slow letters under the earth. The sensor chirped, and the readout showed a palette of thin blue lines, and then, threaded beneath them, a tone that did not belong. The researcher logged the anomaly, then heard nothing but the slow mechanical breath of their own equipment and kept walking. It is tempting to say that was the moment the mystery broke. It wasn't. A single note does not make a song until someone hums it again. That hum came 3 weeks later in a different basin, where the same instrument recorded the same thin needle of sound. Nobody heard it with their ears. Machines did, and machines prefer patterns to miracles. The data was sent to a lab that screens for noise and meaning, and because the instrument had been used near sensitive installations before, the lab ruled out the obvious culprits. No known broadcast. No military test. Not a flare of cosmic origin. The tone was not random. Its intervals repeated with the vandalism of a clock that refuses to keep time, but insists on being noticed. The lab flagged the record, sent a courteous message up the chain, and returned to other problems. Somewhere else, a junior analyst with a cheap coffee and a reputation for obsession pulled the tone apart and laid it next to a library of signatures. They matched nothing until they matched something broken. Emergency beacons speak a language built to be understood by satellites, constant and indifferent. When they fail, they do so in characteristic ways. A cracked housing yields static. A failed oscillator yields silence. A damaged amplifier can sing a song to itself, loud enough for nearby rock to dance with it very slightly. And a directional sensor planted by a graduate student to study that rock may record the dance as music. That is a theory, not a conclusion. And the difference matters. But the theory was enough to awaken a case that had cooled from scarlet to steel. They had intended to cross the valley in 3 days, which is a plan that fits neatly on paper, but not always on land. The first day was meant to be a rehearsal of competence, a gentle descent to a campground scribbled along a wash, where creosote smells like medicine, and the evening rises out of the earth like steam. Claire Donnelly and Jacob Rios recorded small triumphs as if to preempt later hunger. A jackrabbit crossing their path without fear, a ribbon of shade surprised out of a canyon wall, and the way cold water tastes when it has no right to be cold. They checked the beacon and watched its small green light, a heartbeat promising presence in a sky that often seems indifferent. That heartbeat is what investigators would later obsess over. A device made to guarantee discovery, its failure became a ghost. The families asked the same question again and again. Why hadn't the beacon called? And in the 5 years of silence, no answer ever seemed satisfactory. Now, with a junior analyst staring at spectral data in a dim office, the impossible seemed possible. The faint, high-frequency pulse resembled the stutter of a wounded signal, the digital cry of a device broken but unwilling to stop. If it belonged to the hiker's beacon, then for 5 years it had been whispering into rock, not into orbit. The desert had carried its voice, not satellites. The FBI was called in not because of the sound itself, but because of what it meant. This was no longer a vague memory of 2 teenagers swallowed by heat. This was evidence fragile, maybe misleading, but evidence. The agency agreed to coordinate with park authorities and geologists, a marriage of investigation and science. If the signal was real, then it was tethered to a place. And if it was tethered to a place, then perhaps the desert had not erased Claire and Jacob after all. The team that assembled was eclectic. Agents who had cut their teeth chasing men across state lines now found themselves studying sediment layers and mineral composition. Scientists accustomed to lecture halls now stood under a sun that punished every doubt. They carried arrays of sensors, acoustic probes, and ground-penetrating radar that hummed faintly, as though already listening for something beneath their boots. The investigation began by retracing what Claire and Jacob had meant to do. Maps were pinned to the sides of vehicles until the wind tore at the corners. Their route traced a loop skirting low canyons before rejoining a service road. The theory was simple. Somewhere along that line, something had fractured. The sound suggested they had not simply wandered until thirst claimed them. It suggested collapse, entrapment, or both. The team moved systematically. Acoustic sensors were planted like seeds in dry soil, left to drink vibrations. For days, the desert offered only silence, the kind that mocks machines. But then, at a narrow chute carved by forgotten floods, the sound rose again, faint but steady. The chute was steep, its floor swallowed in shadow. To lean over its edge was to feel the drag of gravity insist on attention. Instruments confirmed what ears could not. The signal was strongest here, in this seam of the earth. The first descent was cautious. Ropes unspooled against rock hot enough to burn palms through gloves. A small drone was lowered first, its rotors kicking dust into spirals. The video feed showed walls tapering inward, then opening into a chamber that seemed sculpted by something patient and relentless. The floor was littered with stones and pale crusts of salt. Then, against the drone's light, a scatter of color appeared unnatural, stubborn against the desert's palette. A fragment of fabric, dulled but still recognizable as neon, wedged beneath a rockfall. The feed froze, as if the machine itself understood the weight of what it saw. When agents hauled the drone back up, the conversation shifted. They were no longer asking if the teenagers had reached this chute. They were asking how far they had gone inside. The chamber was deemed unstable, so a remote camera was threaded down on cables. The image it sent up was grainy, but undeniable. Straps from a pack, partially crushed. A metal bottle warped by heat. Evidence of human presence. Entombed. The families were informed in measured tones. Not discovery, not recovery, just evidence. Fragile as ash. Claire's sister asked the only question that mattered. Were they still alive when they fell into that chamber? No one could answer. Not yet. Excavation was debated, and then delayed. Collapse was possible. Lives could be lost in an attempt to confirm death. The desert has no patience for sentiment. Instead, they documented, they measured, and they left. But the sound remained. The damaged beacon kept whispering, as if unwilling to let silence reclaim the chamber completely. It pulsed faintly through the rock, insistent, a broken machine refusing to give up its vigil. And for investigators, that pulse was not just a signal. It was a question. What else had survived down there with it? The chute where the signal lived became a destination, and destinations change people. What had been abstract grief for 5 years turned suddenly geographic. Families drove for hours just to stand near the cordon and look at the crack in the earth, as if proximity alone could barter answers. Agents and scientists moved with rehearsed neutrality, but the truth was simple. Every decision carried more risk than certainty. Excavation in terrain like this is closer to surgery than construction. One wrong gesture, and the wound closes forever. Engineers studied the chamber through LiDAR scans, stitched together from the drone's descent, mapping volumes of air and stone in 3-dimensional detail. The images showed a cavity shaped like a clenched fist, with fissures radiating outward that could shift if weight was redistributed. The fabric fragment, visible in the feed, sat near the knuckles, caught in a tumble of fractured rock. The debate was intense. Should they breach the chamber? Should they attempt to recover? Collapse was inevitable. The question was when. The beacon's signal complicated everything. It was still alive, and that meant circuits had survived pressure, heat, and time. If metal could persist, maybe other things had too. The FBI's role shifted from observation to command. Evidence had to be preserved, not just for families but for a record. A portable command center sprouted antennas like spines, feeding data back east. Specialists in forensic recovery were flown in, accustomed to sifting rubble where tragedy hides its face. The chamber became less a cave and more a crime scene suspended in advance. The first attempt to reach inside was mechanical. A small robotic crawler, fitted with cameras and an articulated claw, was lowered slowly on a tether. Its light threw sharp shadows, making the chamber's salt-crusted walls look like frozen waves. The crawler picked its way forward until it reached the fabric fragment. The claw extended, pinched delicately, and pulled. The fabric tore free. When it was hauled up into daylight, hands trembled despite training. What lay across the evidence sheet was unmistakably a section of nylon jacket, once fluorescent pink, now faded to a ghost of itself. A zipper dangled from the torn edge. It was Claire's. The families were told in tones meant to comfort, but that could never be soft enough. Confirmation of presence is not the same as confirmation of fate, but it pressed hope into a smaller box. Claire had been here. Jacob, by logic or loyalty, had too. The next days blurred into a choreography of dust, rope, and careful descent. The robotic crawler returned again and again, retrieving small relics. A crushed flashlight, its batteries long bled dry, a bent aluminum trekking pole, fragments of a notebook whose pages had fused into a block unreadable by eye. Each item was sealed, catalogued, bagged, and logged, as if the act of recording could blunt the edge of their meaning. Then came the darker turn. In one of the scans, a shape was noted. At first it was dismissed as mineral geometry, a slab against shadow. But as resolution sharpened, contours betrayed themselves. A curve too smooth, angles too deliberate. Bone. The word was spoken softly, then written with more care than any other word had been in the file. Bone. The chamber's instability made full retrieval impossible. Instead, photos were taken with long lenses, measurements computed, and the fragment's location marked. Investigators briefed the families with caution. This was preliminary, unconfirmed. But the impact was seismic. For years the teenagers had been missing. Now at least one had been found, even if in the cruelest way. But the desert was not done. The beacon still whispered. It was impossible, investigators knew, for the device to have powered itself this long. Standard batteries should have died years before. Yet when technicians tested its frequency, they found the faint oscillation still steady. Either the desert had preserved energy in a way physics did not prefer, or something else within that chamber was sustaining it. That mystery kept the site alive even as dread settled like dust. The operation expanded. Satellite imagery was requisitioned to model the chamber's depth. Seismic sensors were planted to record micro-tremors in case collapse accelerated. Each new dataset added weight without relief. At night, when crews retired to the base camp, the desert stretched outward like a ledger without end. Stars burned holes in the sky but offered no answers. The families lingered by lanterns, trading stories not to comfort each other, but to insist that memory had to be louder than silence. The question that hung over every conversation was the simplest and cruelest. If Claire and Jacob had reached this chamber, how long had they survived inside before the desert finished what it began? The sound of the beacon seemed to pulse through that question, refusing to let it sleep. Every investigation carries a point where imagination threatens to outrun evidence. In this case, the line blurred as soon as bone was mentioned. Suddenly, everyone saw endings before they were proven and heard echoes that might not exist. But the FBI understood discipline. They needed sequence. not speculation. The chamber became the focal point, but the path to it mattered just as much. Agents retraced the original route Claire and Jacob had planned. Trailhead logs confirmed the car left at the parking area. A receipt from a roadside gas station confirmed the last purchase: 2 gallons of water and a sleeve of crackers. Witnesses remembered them, young, polite, and laughing too loudly for the heat. After that, the desert erased them until the chute. The FBI worked backward from the chamber, building a shadow itinerary. Footprints, long since blown into anonymity, offered nothing. But geology does not forget. Scrapes on rock surfaces where metal struck stone were analyzed, matching the alloy of trekking poles retrieved from the chamber. A faint smear of nylon, visible under ultraviolet light on one ledge, suggested a slip, a near fall, or both. They had come this way. The chamber itself demanded answers. Why descend into a chute that warned of collapse? The canyon where it opened was narrow, a place where shadows give false promises of water. Perhaps they had chased relief, or shade, or curiosity, or perhaps the desert had offered them no choice. The probe missions intensified. A second robotic crawler, smaller and more flexible, was threaded through fissures the first machine could not reach. Its feed jittered with static, but enough resolve to reveal more evidence. Fragments of fabric that matched Jacob's pack, lodged against a boulder, a shoe, partially crushed, the contours of a skeletal foot inside. The images were relayed to the command tent, where silence fell heavier than heat. For the families, this was no longer a disappearance. It was confirmed presence in death's orbit. The question shifted from "where are they?" to "how did they die?" Forensics leaned in. The shoe fragment was analyzed remotely via high-resolution imaging. Soil samples clinging to the rubber indicated mineral deposits rich in gypsum, consistent with the chamber floor. Moisture trapped in the salt crust was tested. Its age suggested intermittent flooding, the kind that arrives without warning in storms dozens of miles away. If Claire and Jacob had been trapped here, the chamber itself might have turned hostile, drowning or suffocating them before the collapse sealed their remains. Yet still, the beacon pulsed. Technicians obsessed over it. Standard survival units could not last more than a few days beyond their power curve, and this one had been singing for half a decade. Examination of the signal showed irregular intervals, suggesting the device had been damaged in a fall. But the endurance implied an external power source. Somewhere in that chamber, something had sustained it. A solar charger left in a shaft of light? A jury-rigged connection powered by desperation? If so, that meant Claire and Jacob had not only reached the chamber, but also had time to think, time to act, and time to resist the desert's will. Agents began constructing a timeline. If the collapse occurred after they were already trapped, the beacon may have been their final act, wired into survival gear in the dark. That idea carried a particular cruelty, that their signal had never been heard, not because they failed, but because physics chose not to listen. The FBI briefed the families in a closed tent, words measured but heavy. The possibility that Claire and Jacob survived for days or weeks inside the chamber, unseen and unheard, broke through defenses built over years of uncertainty. One father asked directly, "Did they die waiting?" The answer was silence, because sometimes silence is the only truth that will not fracture under pressure. At the chute, the debate over recovery flared again. Structural engineers warned that a single excavation could trigger catastrophic collapse. Forensic experts argued that without remains, cause of death could never be established. Families demanded closure. Agents balanced duty against risk. The chamber waited, patient as only stone can be. Meanwhile, data from the beacon grew stranger. Its pulse weakened, as though finally conceding to entropy. Then, for a brief period, it spiked, broadcasting in irregular bursts, before fading again. Some interpreted it as circuitry burning out. Others wondered if shifting rock had altered the antenna, giving the machine one last scream into the void. The desert does not explain itself. It gives fragments, asks humans to weave them into stories, and dares them to believe those stories are true. For the FBI, weaving meant evidence, not myth. The evidence said this: Claire and Jacob reached the chute, entered the chamber, left pieces of themselves behind, and never walked back out. What remained unsolved was not their motive, but the desert's. Why here? Why this chamber? Why the sound that lasted 5 years? Those questions would not stay unanswered for long. By the 5th week of the operation, the chamber had acquired a personality, spoken of like an adversary rather than an environment. Agents described its moods, how the walls shifted under heat, how its silence deepened at night, and how even the air seemed to resist entry. The families gathered at the perimeter fence each morning, their faces caught between dread and a stubborn hope that at least one truth would finally climb out of the earth. Engineers returned with a plan more fragile than confidence. Instead of breaching from above, which risked collapse, they proposed a lateral approach, drilling a narrow borehole into the chamber's side, just wide enough for cameras, sensors, and an extraction tube. The hole would relieve pressure slowly, reduce sudden shifts, and allow forensic work without stepping foot inside. It was not a rescue. It was an autopsy through stone. The drilling began at dawn. Steel teeth bit into sandstone, echoing through the canyon like a magnified heartbeat. Dust clouded the air, coating equipment in a fine film. Families listened from a distance, each vibration a reminder that the chamber was being pried open, that something once hidden was about to be forced into daylight. When the borehole broke through, the change was immediate. Air hissed out, stale and mineral-rich, carrying with it a smell that agents would later struggle to describe. Part decay, part chemical, part the sourness of years trapped in darkness. Into that thin vein of access, they lowered a microcamera, its lens small enough to slip between grains of sand. The first images confirmed what the crawler had already suggested: collapsed stone, fragments of gear, and human remains pinned in unnatural stillness. But the camera pressed further, twisting into gaps the crawler could not navigate. What it revealed drew the operation into darker terrain. Against one wall, a skeletal form slumped, partially shielded by what remained of a backpack. Beside it lay the beacon, jury-rigged with wires leading to a solar charger wedged in a shaft of fractured rock where sunlight must have bled through for brief hours each day. The setup was crude but deliberate. Someone had tried to keep the beacon alive. That discovery reframed everything. Claire and Jacob had not simply fallen into the chamber and waited helplessly. At least one of them had survived long enough to work, to connect wires, and to improvise in the dark. They had fought against silence. But the camera lingered on something else, scratches etched into the rock, just above the skeletal form. Marks too deliberate to be natural. Lines crossed and recrossed, gouged deep by desperation. Counting marks. Days tallied in stone. Investigators froze the feed and counted slowly. 47. 47 days. The revelation dropped like a weight. 47 days trapped, sustained by ration supplies and bitter determination. 47 days of hope, tethered to a broken beacon that never cried loudly enough. The camera shifted again, revealing a second form partially obscured under rubble. Smaller, less complete. The collapse had claimed it violently. Whether it was Jacob or Claire was impossible to tell. What was visible were bones fractured by stone and fabric pressed flat by years of pressure. The chamber was no longer speculation. It was proof of survival, proof of struggle, and proof of loss, extended into cruelty. The borehole allowed for limited extraction. The evidence tube drew up fragments, fibers of clothing, strands of hair, and a rusted pocket knife, with initials faintly scratched into the handle. Each item confirmed presence, identity, and the stubborn refusal of the desert to erase everything. The FBI gathered the families in the command tent again, this time with photographs displayed on sterile monitors. The scratches, the beacon, the skeletal remains. Words were not needed. The images carved themselves into memory. A mother whispered the tally aloud, 47, as if speaking it made the survival real, even as it doubled the tragedy. The decision was made to halt further drilling. The chamber could not yield its occupants without collapsing entirely. It would remain a tomb, evidence sealed within stone. But enough had been retrieved to confirm the timeline: descent, entrapment, survival, and eventual collapse. Yet one question remained unanswered. If they survived 47 days, why had they not been found? Helicopters had flown overhead. Search teams had scoured canyons. The beacon had been activated. Why had nothing reached them? That question gnawed at the FBI. It was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of the system. And hidden in the data, they believed, was the explanation why a device meant to scream had only whispered into stone. The chamber had given them bones, scratches, and relics of desperate ingenuity. Now the focus shifted to technology, to signal paths, to the cruel irony of a beacon that lived for years, yet never saved the lives it was meant to guard. In the aftermath of the borehole revelations, the chamber seemed to breathe differently. Not louder, not quieter, just heavier, as if awareness itself had changed its weight. The 47 scratches cut into stone refused to leave the investigators' minds. Survival had been proven, but salvation had failed. The question was why. The beacon, retrieved in fragments from the borehole tube, became the new centerpiece of inquiry. Its casing was battered, and the circuitry was corroded, but the wires attached to the solar charger still clung stubbornly to their ports. Forensic technicians in latex gloves dismantled it piece by piece, documenting every screw and every trace of solder. This was no longer about desert silence. It was about technological betrayal. The initial tests confirmed what some had feared. The beacon had indeed activated properly. At some point, likely within hours of their entrapment, a distress signal had been transmitted. But the circuitry bore evidence of catastrophic damage, heat stress, microfractures from impact, and most crucially, a bent antenna assembly that had altered its frequency range. Instead of broadcasting on the standard emergency channel, the beacon had been screaming on a spectral band no receiver was listening to. The FBI brought in specialists from satellite networks. Together, they reconstructed the signal's behavior across time, running simulations that mapped how it might have bounced through Death Valley's geology. Their conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The beacon had worked, but it had been shouting into a void. And yet, not entirely. The ultrasonic hum that scientists had picked up years later was traced directly back to this malfunction. When the antenna bent, it created an unintended oscillation, an endless pulse on a frequency beyond human hearing. In other words, the beacon hadn't died when it should have. It had lived, crying out continuously, but in a tongue no rescuer could understand. Investigators cross-checked search records from those first desperate weeks 5 years earlier. Helicopters had flown over the region multiple times. Ground crews had scoured the very canyon above the chamber. But because the beacon's distress signal never reached the satellites, rescuers passed within hundreds of feet of the trapped teenagers and never knew. That irony cut deeper than any revelation of bones or tally marks. Claire and Jacob had done everything right. They carried the beacon, activated it, and even kept it alive with ingenuity and scraps of sunlight. They had survived 47 days longer than anyone had imagined possible in such a hostile place because they believed someone would come. But the technology meant to bridge the gap had built a wall instead. In the command tent, engineers laid out the findings for the families: diagrams of frequencies, simulations of bent antennas, and forensic photographs of charred circuits. It was a language of failure, translated into science. The parents listened, nodding slowly, until one of them asked in a voice drained of everything, "So they were there, waiting, and we just never heard them?" No one answered, because the answer was already heavy in the room. The FBI's case file began to shift tone. What had started as a disappearance now became a study in systemic tragedy. The hikers' choices were not reckless. They were prepared, experienced, and resilient. The desert did not simply swallow them, they survived it. What killed them was silence engineered by accident, a failure of design colliding with the cruelty of geology. But questions persisted. If the signal had been warped into the ultrasonic range, why had it carried so far through stone that scientists detected it years later? Geologists explained, Death Valley's subsurface is a lattice of salt and sandstone, dense enough to act like a tuning fork. The beacon's malfunction had turned it into a kind of seismic singer, its pulse resonating through the rock, traveling miles underground until it emerged where instruments happened to be listening. It was as if the desert itself had been holding onto their last cry, keeping it sealed until chance and technology aligned years later. The discovery reverberated beyond the canyon. Experts debated survival equipment standards, questioning why devices did not fail-safe into redundancy. Legislators murmured about oversight. Manufacturers tightened their language around reliability. But for the families at the perimeter fence, these shifts were abstractions. What mattered was that Claire and Jacob had survived long enough to believe rescue was possible. What mattered was that rescue had been inches away yet infinitely out of reach. As night fell over the camp, lantern light flickered across weary faces. The desert stretched outward again, vast and indifferent, its silence unbroken. Yet now that silence carried meaning, because beneath it lay scratches on stone, a broken beacon, and two young lives that had fought against disappearance longer than anyone could have imagined. The FBI had solved the mechanical mystery. The question now was how to carry the human one, how to tell the story, not as an accident alone, but as a testament. Proof that even in the harshest emptiness, resistance can leave a mark that refuses to vanish. The chamber had given its evidence. The beacon had confessed its failure. The engineers had mapped the signal's ghost through stone. What remained was the hardest part, the burden of truth carried by the families who had waited half a decade for answers, and now found themselves confronting a reality far heavier than absence. The FBI arranged a private viewing of the recovered items before they were sealed into evidence storage. On a long metal table lay what the desert had spared. Fragments of clothing faded by dust, the pocket knife engraved with initials, a section of the beacon still wired to its charger, and a small notebook warped by moisture. The notebook contained no legible words. Ink had bled into abstract swirls, but the very presence of it suggested writing had been attempted. Thoughts recorded in darkness, now dissolved beyond recovery. Claire's mother reached for the knife, her hand hovering before she withdrew. Jacob's father picked up the frayed strap of a backpack, turning it over as though it might reveal something more if he held it just right. These were not possessions anymore. They were proof of struggle, tokens of days counted and endured. The tally marks haunted everyone. 47 days. The FBI avoided saying it aloud, but the number had already branded itself into every conversation. 47 days meant they had not simply disappeared into the desert like so many before them. They had survived. They had waited. They had hoped. And then silence had consumed them. For the families, grief took different shapes. Some found a grim solace in knowing the truth, however merciless. Others collapsed under the cruelty of survival, wasted by technology. One parent said quietly, "I would have rather thought they died on the first day, not this." Another countered, "No, they fought. They fought to live. That matters." The divide between tragedy and testament widened, but neither side could claim relief. Outside the command tent, the desert stretched indifferent. Journalists pressed at the perimeter, their cameras eager for statements, but the families remained inside, clinging to privacy. The FBI prepared a press release that distilled the enormity into sterile phrases. Remains located. Equipment malfunction. Confirmed survival period. The words flattened the reality until it barely resembled the 47 tally marks carved by desperate hands. Yet the human story could not be contained. As news broke, public reaction surged. Viewers across the country imagined the young hikers counting days in darkness, feeding life into a beacon that would never save them. Forums filled with speculation, anger, and sorrow. Survivalists dissected every choice. Engineers debated every wire. But for the families, the noise meant little. Their truth was not theoretical. Their truth was carved into stone. At night, under the desert's cold sky, some of them returned quietly to the canyon rim. They stood at the edge, staring into the vastness where their children had vanished, listening for a silence now thick with meaning. Some left flowers weighted with stones, so the wind could not scatter them. Others left notes, as if words could travel downward, through sand and salt and reach the chamber below. The FBI offered options for memorialization. The chamber could be sealed permanently, preserving it as a tomb. Or a plaque could be placed at the trailhead, warning future hikers and honoring those lost. The families debated, voices breaking under the weight of decision. Seal the chamber, and it remained private, untouched. Mark the trail, and their story became cautionary, part of the desert's mythology. Neither choice erased the scratches, the beacon, or the bones. Meanwhile, agents finalized their report. They reconstructed the timeline. October morning departure, entry into canyon, descent into chute, collapse, survival, improvised repairs to beacon, tally marks accumulating, eventual failure. The case file thickened into closure. But closure was an illusion. Truth had been revealed, yes. Yet truth without return felt like another form of silence. The desert seemed to conspire in that illusion. By day it glared hot and merciless, as though mocking the idea of survival. By night it whispered with winds that carried echoes of voices too faint to distinguish. For those who had waited 5 years, the revelation of what happened did not ease the ache of why it happened, or why help had never reached them. And still, in the quiet moments between briefings and procedures, one question refused to die. Had Claire and Jacob believed, to the very end, that rescue was coming? Had they counted their 47 days not as a sentence but as a bridge to salvation? Or had they realized, too late, that their voices were lost to a frequency no one could hear? The FBI could not answer that. The desert would not answer that. Only the scratches in stone remained, the purest language of survival and despair. The canyon was quiet again, the drilling equipment removed, and the borehole capped. What remained was not just a chamber sealed in stone, but a story that could no longer be hidden. When the FBI released its findings to the public, the narrative spread quickly, igniting both grief and outrage. 2 teenagers had survived 47 days in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, clinging to life through ingenuity and determination, only to be abandoned by a beacon that spoke in the wrong language. Policymakers seized on the failure. In congressional hearing rooms far from the desert, experts testified about frequency redundancy, manufacturing oversight, and the absence of fail-safe designs. Diagrams of antennas were projected onto sterile screens, their bent angles now symbols of fatal oversight. Lawmakers pressed engineers. Why could a device marketed as infallible fail in such a catastrophic way? The answers were clinical material fatigue, impact stress, misaligned resonance. But beneath the jargon lay a truth harder to accept. No one had imagined this precise combination of accident and environment. No one had planned for silence this absolute. Regulatory agencies proposed reforms. Future beacons would require dual-channel transmission, error detection algorithms, and more robust housing. Manufacturers bristled at the costs, but the public pressure was unrelenting. The story of the canyon teenagers had struck a chord too deep to ignore. They were no longer individuals. They had become archetypes of survival denied by design. In the survivalist community, debates burned hotter. Forums filled with arguments about redundancy, whether every hiker should carry two beacons, whether analog flares were more reliable than satellites, whether reliance on technology had created a false sense of safety. For veterans of the wilderness, the lesson was cruelly simple. No device could replace instinct and preparation. Yet even they admitted that no amount of instinct could have altered a collapsed canyon chamber sealed beneath tons of rock. The irony was not lost on anyone. The beacon had not failed quietly. It had failed noisily, screaming into ultrasonic frequencies for years, a sound so persistent it eventually reached scientists studying unrelated phenomena. Rescue had come, but too late, because the scream had been pitched just beyond human grasp. That irony became the story's hook in countless retellings. The desert had heard them, but the world had not. For the families, these broader conversations felt distant. They sat through policy briefings, listened to apologies, and watched as their children's names became case studies in survival training manuals. But none of it bridged the gap left by the tally marks carved into stone. 47 days was no longer just a measure of time. It was a scar etched into their imaginations, replayed endlessly in dreams, where rescue came one day too late. The media, relentless in its hunger, recast the narrative into countless forms. Documentary specials, podcasts, dissecting the investigation, and opinion pieces about the limits of technology. Each version sought meaning. Some found inspiration in the hiker's willpower. Others leaned into horror, emphasizing the darkness, the scratching of days into walls. But every version returned to the same bitter truth. Survival had been possible. Rescue had been possible. Failure had been engineered. In Death Valley itself, the canyon took on new weight. Rangers erected discreet signs, warning of unstable chutes and concealed drop-offs, though no marker could capture the reality of what lay sealed beneath. Tourists arrived in greater numbers, drawn by morbid curiosity, standing at the rim with cameras, pointing toward a landscape that looked unchanged yet carried invisible history. Locals muttered about intrusion, about tragedy turned into attraction. But they too understood that once a story like this escaped, it could never be contained. Some argued the canyon should be closed permanently, a sacred tomb. Others wanted a memorial, something tangible beyond the borehole and the sealed chamber. The debate split communities: honor by silence or honor by story. For now, the desert remained mute, offering no preference, its silence echoing louder than any human decision. Meanwhile, the FBI continued its forensic review. Beyond closure, they sought lessons: how to refine search protocols, how to better interpret partial signals, and how to recognize the strange echoes of malfunctioning devices. The case file, once slim, had become encyclopedic, a manual for preventing repetition. In its pages, Claire and Jacob were not just victims, they were data points, teachers of a harsh lesson purchased at unbearable cost. Yet outside the file, in the raw human spaces of kitchens and bedrooms, the lesson was different. Parents stared at empty chairs, at photos now relics. Friends scrolled through old messages, frozen at the last cheerful check-in before the desert swallowed sound. These were not statistics. They were voices, laughter, and plans for futures that had ended in tally marks on stone. The canyon mystery had been cracked. The beacon's secret had been revealed. Policy would change, technology would adapt, and training manuals would carry the lesson forward. But none of it softened the irony. For 47 days, the teenagers had lived with the certainty that someone would come. For 47 days, they had resisted despair. And yet, for 47 days, they were alone. Their cries transformed into a frequency only the desert itself could hold. Time did what it always does. It carried the story outward, reshaping it, eroding details, and polishing edges until it became something more than a case file. The canyon where two teenagers vanished and endured 47 days underground began to slip into cultural memory, not merely as tragedy, but as legend. Writers invoked it in essays about the fragility of human reliance on machines. Podcasters revisited it as a parable about the limits of modern safety. Survival instructors held up the tally marks as proof of willpower, a testament to endurance even when salvation failed. Slowly, the story became less about Claire and Jacob as individuals and more about what they represented: determination, facing indifference, voices swallowed by silence, and faith persisting until the end. In Death Valley itself, the canyon drew pilgrims. Some came in quiet reverence, leaving small offering stones painted with names, scraps of fabric tied to sagebrush, and handwritten notes weighted against the wind. Others came in curiosity, seeking the place where survival had intersected with futility. Rangers watched the influx with unease, balancing respect with caution. Too many footsteps risked turning a scar into a spectacle, yet the desert resisted commodification. To most visitors, it offered nothing more than heat and emptiness. The chamber remained sealed, its tally marks hidden, accessible only through reports and memory. For the families, legacy was heavier. They were approached by filmmakers, journalists, and authors, all wanting access to their grief. Some declined, insisting that silence was the truest tribute. Others cooperated, believing the story should be told so that no one else would face such a fate. Their decisions fractured, but each path carried the same burden: how to preserve dignity when the world sought narrative. Academics wrote about the irony, the way the beacon's failure had turned the canyon into both a tomb and transmitter. They described it as technological myth-making, a device built to save, instead becoming the instrument of silence, then years later transforming again into a ghost signal that lured discovery. For them, the case was not just tragedy, but allegory of human invention, undone by chance, survival defeated, not by weakness, but by misplaced faith in wires and circuits. The desert itself became a character in the retelling. Writers spoke of it as judge and witness, a landscape that did not kill directly, but orchestrated the conditions of suffering. Heat by day, cold by night, stone above ceiling, darkness below. The desert was indifferent, and in its indifference lay terror. Yet some insisted there was also strange mercy in how it had preserved the chamber, how it had held the tally marks intact long enough to be found. Silence, they argued, was not cruelty but memory. The hiker's story also seeped into local lore. Guides whispered it on twilight tours, embellishing details until it took on a ghostly shimmer. Campfire retellings cast the ultrasonic signal as a haunting, the canyon itself humming with the voices of those who had perished. Rational or not, the tale fused with the mythos of Death Valley, a place already thick with stories of vanished travelers and unforgiving landscapes. But beyond myth, policy continued to evolve. Beacons were redesigned. Training emphasized redundancy. New search protocols instructed teams to treat even anomalous signals as potential cries for help. In this way, the hikers lived on not as names in a legend, but as silent instructors shaping the survival of others. For those closest to the lost, though, myth and policy were poor substitutes. In bedrooms back home, photographs still hung on walls. Birthdays arrived uncelebrated. Laughter was remembered in echoes. For them, the story would never be about technological irony or cultural legacy. It was simply absence, stretched across time, punctuated by the unbearable knowledge of 47 days in darkness. And yet, despite grief's permanence, the story resisted vanishing entirely into despair. Because within those days was not only suffering, but also endurance. Every tally mark carved into stone was also defiance. Every improvised charge of the beacon was also hope. Even as the desert withheld rescue, the teenagers had lived as if rescue were possible. That persistence became their final gift, a reminder that survival is not only about outcome, but about refusal to surrender, even when surrender seems inevitable. The canyon holds no monument. The chamber is sealed, the tally marks hidden from sight, and still, the silence carries memory. Travelers pass through unaware, their footsteps crunching over the surface of stone that hides a story too vast for the ground to contain. But for those who know, the silence is never empty. It is filled with the echo of days counted, of hope stretched to its breaking point, of voices that once called in frequencies too high for human ears. That silence is the story's legacy, and it does not fade. At dawn, the desert is deceptive. Light floods the horizon in sheets of gold, painting jagged ridges with warmth that feels almost gentle. The silence is immense, so complete that the crunch of a single step seems intrusive. From the rim of the canyon, the land stretches endless and indifferent, a vast cathedral of stone that has held too many secrets. It was here that two teenagers entered, laughing, confident, and carrying the tools they believed would guarantee safety. It was here that stone shifted, a chute collapsed, and their lives were rerouted into darkness. And it was here, years later, that the truth finally surfaced, pulled from silence by the unlikeliest of signals, an accidental scream buried in frequencies no ear could hear. The chamber below is sealed now. Engineers have reinforced its mouth, closing the passage not out of cruelty, but for protection. Within those walls lie the scratches that counted days, the fragments of gear that bore witness, and the story written not in ink, but in endurance. 47 tally marks, etched by hands refusing to surrender. 47 days of waiting for rescue that never came. To stand at the rim is to feel the dissonance between surface and depth. Up here, the desert feels eternal, unchanged. Down there lies a record of survival that should have rewritten fate but instead remained hidden until hope was long gone. The air carries no trace of their voices, the sand offers no sign of their presence. Yet memory persists. Invisible, but insistent. The FBI case file is closed. The beacon is shelved in evidence storage, its bent antenna frozen in failure. Policies have changed. Devices have been redesigned, and protocols have been rewritten. The world has learned, at least on paper. But the desert itself offers no assurance that such lessons will endure. Its silence is older than policy, older than technology, older than any attempt at mastery. It reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, not by preparation, not by machines, not even by willpower. And yet, to remember their story only as tragedy is to erase what those tally marks reveal. They did not give in. They did not stop counting days, even as the canyon closed around them. Their story is not merely about how they died, but about how fiercely they tried to live. That distinction matters. It is what carries their memory beyond silence, into the minds of those who hear their story and promise not to forget. When the wind moves through the canyon, it whistles faintly against the stone. To some, it is only air. To others, it feels like resonance, as though the desert itself remembers. Perhaps it is imagination, perhaps grief shaping sound into meaning. But once you know the story, once you have traced the line of days carved into stone, you cannot stand here without hearing something more. The desert will hold their silence forever, but the rest of us, far from the canyon's rim, can choose what to carry forward. Their story is now ours to tell, not as a spectacle, but as a testament. Because even in the deepest darkness, even when their voices could not reach the world, they left proof that they had lived, endured, and believed rescue was possible. And that belief, stubborn, fragile, unwavering, is what lingers longest. And as with every story we tell here, if you want to continue exploring the hidden truths that surface from silence, consider subscribing. It ensures these voices, even fractured and incomplete, are never lost again.